The wildlife rescuer arrived before the sun had fully risen, and the forest around the small rehabilitation outpost still hummed with the quiet hush of early morning, as soft light filtered through the branches above, casting long pale ribbons across the enclosure where the rescued fleet of young cubs slept in a tangled heap of fur and tiny paws. Yet even from a distance, she sensed that something was different, something slightly off in the gentle rhythm she had grown used to during the past weeks of caring for them. She stepped closer, walking slowly so she would not startle the little creatures, and as she reached the low wooden gate, she saw that one cub was not with the others, but instead curled tightly against the far corner, its body pressed small and trembling against the cool earth as though trying to disappear into the shadows. Her stomach tightened with concern because this particular cub normally darted around with boundless energy, wrestling anyone who came near, and chirping for attention at every chance. Yet now its ears drooped low, its eyes half closed, and its breath came in faint, uneven shivers, causing her to pause and listen closely to the soft sound of air moving through its tiny chest. She knelt beside the gate, observing the cub carefully, and feeling that deep instinctive pull that rose in her heart whenever one of her rescued animals needed help. And though she tried to stay calm, she could not ignore the growing fear that the little one might be falling ill. The rest of the fleet remained asleep for the moment, unaware of the worry building behind her steady breath, but she knew that once they woke, any shift in mood would ripple through the group like a wave, since cubs were quick to sense distress in both their own kind and in the humans who cared for them. She reached for the latch and slipped quietly inside the enclosure, stepping with deliberate care across the soft ground until she was close enough to feel the faint trembling of the cub's body in the air around it, and she slowly extended her hand, letting the cub smell her presence before she touched it. When her fingertips brushed the fur, she felt the heat beneath its coat, a subtle but unmistakable warmth that told her something was not right, and the cub let out the smallest weary sound, a soft, almost silent plea that made her chest ache with helplessness. She whispered soothing words without making a sound in her throat, gently scooping the cub into her arms where its trembling eased only a little, yet enough to show that it trusted her completely, and she knew she needed to act quickly to bring comfort and care before its condition could grow worse. She carried the small, trembling cub into the supply shed just beside the enclosure, a cramped wooden space lined with shelves stacked in uneven rows filled with blankets, bottles, salves, and every odd remedy she had gathered over the years, and she gently laid the cub on a thick folded cloth so its body would not lose any more warmth. As she moved through the narrow room, her fingers brushed against tins, jars, and pouches, each one sparking a memory of some creature she had once helped, but none seemed quite right for the fragile state of the cub, who watched her through heavy, half-closed eyes, its breaths still small and fluttering like leaves caught in a weak breeze. She opened a drawer, searching with growing urgency, until her hand closed around a small cloth pouch tucked in the back end. When she drew it out, she recognized the faint herbal scent drifting from within, a soothing blend of mild leaves, safe for young animals, something she had used only a few times but remembered well. A tiny spark of hope warmed her chest as she set a small kettle on the portable camp stove and struck the lighter, listening to the soft hiss as the flame caught and settled into a steady glow beneath the metal base, and soon thin wisps of steam rose curling into the cool morning air. She poured in clean water and added a pinch of the herbal mixture, watching the pale green tinge begin to swirl through the liquid, and she felt a steadying calm return to her, as if the simple act of brewing the tea gave her purpose and focus. Pushing back her earlier fear, the cub shifted wearily on the blanket, its eyes tracking her every motion with quiet trust, and she knelt beside it, letting the warm steam drift gently over its small face before she poured a small amount of the tea into a shallow bowl and placed it within easy reach. The cub leaned forward slowly, its nose dipping toward the bowl, drawn by the warmth and the soft, earthy scent, and with a hesitant flick of its tongue it tasted the liquid, then took another slow sip, then another, as though each swallow soothed the trembling that had plagued its body moments before. Seeing this tiny response, the rescuer felt relief wash through her like sunlight breaking through clouded skies, and she stayed by the cub's side, ready to offer comfort for as long as it needed. The cub's slow, careful sips turned into a steadier rhythm, and the rescuer watched with quiet awe as the tiny creature began to relax, its rigid posture softening little by little beneath the comfort of the warm herbal tea, and she felt a gentle ease settle over her, as well as if the rising steam carried away the fear that had clung to her since dawn. She shifted to sit cross-legged beside the cub, keeping one hand lightly on its back, feeling the faint tremors gradually fade beneath her palm, and the cub leaned into the warmth of her touch, its small body finally loosening, as though it trusted that she would guard it from whatever discomfort lingered in its fragile frame. The morning light began to brighten outside the shed, sending soft gold strokes through the spaces in the wooden walls, and she could hear the distant rustle of the other cubs slowly waking in the enclosure, their sleepy chirps drifting faintly through the air. Buffed as she stayed focused on the little one before her, knowing its needs came first. With each passing moment the cub seemed to grow more present, its eyes lifting a bit higher, its ears perking slightly, as if the warmth in its belly sparked returning strength, and she found herself letting out a long breath she had not realized she was holding, relieved to see even the slightest sign of improvement. When the cub finished its small serving of tea, it nudged its nose against her knee, in a gesture so gentle and deliberate that she felt her chest tighten with affection and gratitude for the silent bond between them, and she brushed her fingers along its cheek, amazed at how such a tiny creature could express trust so clearly. She knew it was not fully well yet, and that more care would be needed throughout the day, but as the cub settled comfortably against her legs and released a soft sigh, she understood that this small moment of peace was the first real step. Healing. The other cubs in the enclosure had fully awakened by the time she stepped back outside, with the recovering cub nestled securely in her arms, and the fleet greeted her with their usual chorus of chirps and rustling paws, though their voices faded into puzzled silence when they noticed the special attention their smallest companion was receiving. She set the cub gently onto a soft patch of sun-warmed earth just inside the enclosure, and remained crouched beside it, keeping her hand nearby in case its strength wavered again, and immediately she felt dozens of curious eyes fixed on her every movement. The nearest cub tilted its head one way, then the other, its ears standing straight with suspicion as it studied the blanket-wrapped cub, while another crept forward as slowly and dramatically as if stalking prey, though its wide blinking eyes revealed pure curiosity rather than caution. Within moments the entire fleet had clustered into a loose circle around the pair, their bodies shifting in subtle waves as they exchanged glances that carried silent questions. Why was this cub carried? Why was it given warmth? Why was there human whispering soft reassurance only into its ears? The rescuer could practically feel the bewildered energy swirling among the young creatures, and she offered them a gentle smile, stroking the recovering cub's back so the others could see it was safe and cared for. But their confusion only deepened as they scented the faint herbal fragrance lingering in its fur. One bold cub leaned closer, sniffing intently at the warm scent, while another tried to imitate the lowered posture of the sick cub, pressing its body into the ground as though demonstrating that it too might need help. And the rest of the fleet watched intently, their minds clearly turning in unison. The rescuer sensed a shift in their behavior, a collective curiosity ripening into something more mischievous, and she braced herself, because with this fleet curiosity often blossomed into unexpected antics, and she suspected the morning was far from over. The circle of cubs grew tighter and tighter until their tiny bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, each one trying to peer past the others to get the best view of the recovering cub, and the rescuer could almost see the sparks of ideas forming in their bright, curious eyes as they took in every detail, from the blanket to the gentle pets to the lingering scent of warm herbal tea. The first sign of mischief came from a young cub known for its dramatic flair, as it suddenly let out a long, exaggerated groan, then flopped sideways into the dirt with such theatrical heaviness that the rescuer blinked in surprise, unsure whether to laugh or worry. And the other cubs froze, watching the performance with fascination. A heartbeat later, another cub followed suit, dropping with an even louder huff and rolling onto its back with its paws curled in the air as if overwhelmed by invisible weakness. And then a third cub staggered forward, dragging one paw stiffly behind it while casting frequent side glances to make sure the rescuer was watching before she could react. The display spread through the fleet like wildfire, and soon nearly every cub was wobbling, swaying, collapsing, or crawling with dramatic slowness, each one emitting the most pitiful attempts at whimpers and faint chirps, though many forgot to actually look miserable and instead peeked through squinted eyes to see if their act was convincing. The rescuer pressed a hand over her mouth, trying to hide the smile tugging at her lips, because she had tended enough injured animals to know when pain was real, and not a single one of these cubs was truly suffering their antics were too perfectly timed, too exaggerated, too filled with sly sideways glances. One cub pretended to faint only to sit up abruptly when another got closer to the rescuer as if competition for attention outweighed commitment to the act. And another rolled dramatically across the ground, then immediately scrambled back to its spot when it realized it had drifted too far from the center of the attention. The recovering cub watched the entire spectacle with sleepy confusion, its ears lifting slightly as it tried to understand why its companions were dropping like leaves all around it, and the rescuer let out a breath, half exasperation, half amusement, realizing that the fleet had drawn a single conclusion from her morning care. If one cub received warm, soothing tea, then obviously the entire fleet must desperately need the same treatment. At first, the rescuer moved toward the nearest collapsing cub with genuine concern still lingering in her instincts, but she stopped halfway when she noticed the tiniest slip in the performance as the cub lifted its head to check whether she was watching, then quickly flopped down again with an overdone sigh that would have embarrassed even the most amateur actor. She slowly turned her gaze across the enclosure, taking in every wobbling paw, every dramatic shiver, every cub that had suddenly forgotten how to stand, and with each glance she caught another telling detail, one cub whispering a quiet chirp to another before both collapsed in perfect unison, another rolling onto its side, only to pop half upright when the rescuer looked away, then hurriedly falling limp again. A soft breath of disbelief escaped her, because the truth was undeniable. The entire fleet was pretending and doing a remarkably terrible job of hiding it, and for a moment she simply stood there, torn between laughter and exasperation. At the sheer determination of these tiny creatures, one bold cub tried to crawl toward her, dragging its back legs behind it, but its performance fell apart when its tail began to wag excitedly, and she watched as the cub froze, realizing the betrayal of its own tail before it quickly resumed its pitiful crawl. Another cub, who had been lying dramatically motionless, suddenly perked up to groom its paw, only to jerk back into its sick pose when it realized she had turned her head that way. The recovering cub looked from one performer to another with growing bewilderment, as if trying to understand why everyone else had suddenly become incapable of walking, and it nudged weakly against her boot as though asking if she was seeing the same absurdity. The rescuer knelt down, laughing silently in her chest, though her face stayed calm, and she reached out to gently pat the nearest pretend patient, realizing that she was not dealing with a fleet of sick cubs at all, but with a fleet of clever schemers who had decided they too deserved a taste of warm, herbal tea. The rescuer rose slowly, brushing dirt from her knees, as the entire fleet of pretending cubs watched her with exaggerated weakness, their bodies draped dramatically across the ground as if gravity itself had grown too heavy for them, and she could almost feel their anticipation buzzing in the air like a low, eager hum. Instead of calling out their act, she moved calmly toward the shed, letting her steps remain steady and unhurried, and the cubs followed her with wide, hopeful eyes, some lifting their heads just enough to track her before remembering to collapse again in their most pitiful poses. She pushed open the shed door and retrieved the small kettle, still warm from earlier, then set it back on the stove to prepare a larger batch of the gentle herbal tea, because if the fleet wanted to play sick, she thought, then she would meet their performance with measured kindness rather than scolding them for their antics. When she returned to the enclosure carrying a full pot of steaming tea, the cubs reacted with sudden bursts of energy before quickly remembering to act weak once more, and they scrambled into a crooked line, each one trying to appear sicker than the last, while stealing glances at the pot as though it held magical treasure. She knelt in the center of their chaotic line and began pouring small servings into shallow bowls, placing them one by one before the eager pretenders, and each cub shuffled forward with dramatic slowness, only to perk up the instant the warm scent reached their noses, as they sipped the tea with suspiciously healthy enthusiasm. She watched them with soft amusement, knowing that, while their deception was transparent, their desire for comfort and attention was sincere, and she offered them both freely as the cubs finished their tiny servings. A ripple of renewed energy spread through the fleet, and their once drooping ears now stood perked and alert, while their eyes shone with unmistakable satisfaction at having received the same special treatment as the recovering cub. The rescuer watched them gather into small clusters, each one chattering softly to the others, as if comparing the taste of their tea and congratulating themselves on the success of their dramatic performance, and she could not help the warm laugh that rose silently in her chest at their innocent triumph. Meanwhile, the recovering cub nestled against her leg, its breathing steadier now as the heat of the tea and the comfort of her touch worked together to ease the lingering discomfort from earlier, and she checked its temperature with gentle fingers, relieved to find the feverish heat had begun to fade. The fleet continued to bounce around her, though they tried half-heartedly to keep up the illusion of sickness, wobbling for a moment before breaking into lively skips that betrayed their true condition, and she let them enjoy their victory, knowing that their playful deception had caused no harm. As the sunlight brightened over the enclosure, she felt a deep sense of peace settle around all of them, a quiet moment of shared connection and trust between the human who cared and the cubs who longed to be cared for. By the time the sun had climbed high into the sky, the entire fleet had gathered around the rescuer in a warm, fluffy heap, their tiny bodies pressing close against her legs and each other, as if to share the lingering warmth of the morning and the soft satisfaction of their successful scheme. The recovering cub lay peacefully in the center of the group, breathing steady and deep, while the other cubs shifted occasionally to nuzzle closer or wiggle a paw against her hand in silent gratitude for the tea and attention they had so cleverly earned. She laughed softly too, herself marveling at the cleverness of these small creatures and at the strange charm of their determination, knowing that the entire fleet had orchestrated a performance more dramatic than anything she had ever witnessed. Yet beneath the playfulness there was unmistakable trust in her care. The cubs began to settle one by one, curling into soft circles, their heads resting against each other, and her legs forming a living warm barrier around the recovering cub, who seemed to understand that it was now safe and cared for fully. For the first time that morning, she ran her fingers gently through their soft fur, feeling the pulse of life and curiosity still dancing beneath the surface, and she realized that these moments of quiet connection were the heart of her work. The reason she had chosen this path, despite the worry, the exhaustion, and the surprises. As she watched the fleet drift into drowsy contentment, she whispered quiet words of reassurance that floated among them like invisible threads, binding their trust and affection together. And she knew that today the cubs had not only been healed with tea, but with love, attention, and the gentle rhythm of shared care.